Hello and welcome back to the trenches. Today we're looking at the Shrine Anchorite for Trench Crusade. This thing is incredible. This is really one of the models that kind of sold me on Trench Crusade, and it's just this really awesome mech that's kind of half church, half mech. It's great. So without further ado, let's get into it. As you can see, I've already primed my 3D print here. So I've done a black prime and then my usual zenithal from above. And then there's two different wheel options, and I'll pick one as we get further into the paint job. So we're starting off with some Ratling Grime, and I decided to cover the whole model. Now this is kind of strange because we just zenithal primed the model, but I really wanted something kind of gritty and dark to kind of base off of. Plus, this is going to do a lot of that kind of inner mechanical work for us, and we don't have to worry about getting a brush in there later on. There is a zenithal underneath, and that's showing through really nicely, so this is a great base to start off with. And once that's dry, you can see it's kind of created almost like a smoky brown-black wash all over, and given us some really nice highlights still, but kind of coated the whole thing in a nice gritty dark shade. And we're going to start off with some Decayed metal. So for this paint scheme, I'm going for kind of an old copper, almost like an old boiler or something, like paint scheme. And so I'm starting off with some Decayed metal, and I'm not really brushing this on, I'm kind of dabbing it on with an old brush and just really letting it kind of create kind of a texture on the metal sections. I'm also taking care not to cover up the wash that we just did with the contrast too much, because I still want some of those shadows to show through. And for a highlight, I'm going to start using some Victorian brass. This works really nice with the Decayed metal and creates kind of a subtle highlight to the metal work without having to add any other kind of whites or ivories or anything to the metallic paint. I find that metallics, if you want to get a highlight on a metallic, you kind of have to mix in another metallic paint to kind of get a really nice highlight. Or you can use a shade higher, which is what I'm doing here. So as you can see, I'm kind of aiming it towards the top ends of the armor sections, so the top of the shoulders, the top of the chest, and just creating some roundness in the highlight. Next up, I'm using plate mail metal, and I'm just kind of dabbing this on to the edges. Any kind of sharp edge is getting just a very, very brief dab of this, and it creates the impression of weathering and kind of a worn metal. And then I'm also using this quite liberally on the crest on the chest. I'm not going too overboard with this, I'm just kind of trying to catch some of those edges with this silver. And then I'm also using this as kind of a dry brush on the chains. Again, I don't want to ruin this nice zenithal highlight kind of contrast wash underneath too much. So this is really just catching the edge of those chains and giving them just a bit of metallic. There's hardly any metallic paint on my brush, but I'm still using it just to kind of dry brush the inner workings of the leg that's on show, and just kind of focus on the upper parts of those chains. Next up, I'm using Baneblade Brown, and I'm dry brushing this onto the kind of steeple helmet, I guess. I love that this is basically just a church roof inside a mech, and so I want to emphasize that by looking up reference for old church roofs and things like that, and I'm starting to dry brush on some Wrathbone to kind of emphasize that this is a stone building or an old tile. I'm still dry brushing like I was on the chains, and I'm kind of focusing it towards the top end of the steeple. And here I'm stippling on some of that Wrathbone to kind of imply really weathered stone, or just something that's been rained on for many, many years. Here's some green sky. This is kind of a more subtle idea, but I'm just dabbing on some of this green sky to imply moss or some kind of old corrosion that's accumulated over the years of just a lot of like rain and weathering. Next up, I'm using some Coelia Greenshade. And this is an odd choice, but I thought it worked really nicely with this brass texture that we've already got going on. And so what this is doing is shading those brass sections and creating a lot more depth in the shadows, but also implying that this is kind of rust or corrosion on these metal sections. And I just really like the green against this kind of brown brassy color. And so I'm just using this for the deep recesses around the chest, and then I'll take a damp brush and feather the edge to help kind of soften that transition. And you can see that I'm not shading the whole section of the armor, I'm just kind of aiming for those shadows. And then I'm going to be using some Nihilak Oxide. This is great for a verdigris texture that kind of accumulates on old copper. And so I'm using this kind of sparingly, but when I do use it, I definitely try to concentrate it in that area. So I'm using it around rivets, hard edges, any kind of embossed or raised section, and just gently applying that in those kind of recesses. It's a bold color, but it's very realistic and it definitely adds to the texture. Here's some Skrag Brown, and I've watered this right the way down, and I'm using this for a rust color. I'm just letting that sink into the chains. I don't want it to sit on top of the chain, I just want it to go into some of the recesses. But I'm selectively choosing some areas that I feel like need some rust. I'm using dark wood, and this is a contrast paint, and letting that sink straight in and letting the zenithal show through underneath. You can really see the natural highlight come through versus the shadow because of that zenithal prime. I'm also using the same dark wood for the wood panels on the back of the Shrine Anchorite. Next up we have Necro Gold, and this is a more muted gold color, but I'm using this for the mace. I had this idea that the mace is just this solid gold, like very ornate thing, and so I just wanted to dry brush on some of this Necro Gold to get like a base tone on here. You can see the handle underneath his hand did catch a little bit of it, but I'm quite happy with that just still remaining black. And then I'm using some Elven Gold as a highlight. Now this is a little bit more subtle than the armor highlight, but it does add just a small edge highlight to the mace, and it just kind of brightens up some of those areas. So I'm focusing this on the top of the mace and the handle. I'm using some Wrathbone to highlight the lamb that's hanging off of the belt. So this is kind of watered down as a first coat, just letting that go over the top of the Ratling Grime, and then slowly building up more and more opaque, just kind of dabbing on some highlights. And I'm building up in those whites until I'm using just pure Wrathbone. And then I'm just getting some of the smaller details like the bell with some of that Necro Gold. Finally, I decided to use some Skrag Brown on the engine. I was going back and forth on whether I should do another metallic on here, but I kind of liked this engine black that the Ratling Grime has brought to this section. So I just decided to add some rust here. And you can see I'm just choosing some select areas to add some of this around the pipes. Here's some coal black. And I'm dry brushing this on the kind of chimney stacks, the smoke stacks on the top of the engine. I've decided to keep the weathering going, so here I'm using some dark streaking grime. Now this is intended for predominantly green vehicles, but it's got this really nice oily green black kind of feel to it, and so I'm using this to kind of shade some of these more mechanical workings and also imply that this whole thing is very oily and old. I'm not too worried about some nice patterns here. I'm just doing some oil streaks, just running the brush down and letting it sink into those recesses. And then I'm also using this for the engine block as well, and the same technique. Next up is Balor Brown, and I'm using this for the ropes on the front of the shrine. This is kind of a bold color, but I'll eventually be shading this and knocking this down a notch. And for the wheel, I decided to go with the one with the poor acolyte strapped to the wheel. I thought that was kind of cool and thematic. So I'm using Crusader skin to shade the flesh tones. I'm not going to be spending too much time on this because I still want the main focus to be the Shrine Anchorite. But you can see it works really well with that zenithal. And then a basic flesh is going to be my kind of mid-tone highlight here. And then I decided he was kind of a bit too warm and alive. I mixed in some Thunderhawk blue to create a very dead flesh look. And so this is a really nice pale blue that kind of implies that he's been there for a minute. I'm just slowly adding this to some of the more upturned areas, but leaving that Crusader skin and that basic flesh in the recesses. I added just a touch of Wrathbone white for a highlight, and I'm using this to edge highlight some of the muscle structure. I've gone back to that Balor Brown and using that again on these ropes. And I'm just taking a little bit of care not to get it on the flesh or the wheel. I'm using Pallid Bone for all of the cloth sections. And there's nothing fancy about this. This is just on top of that zenithal. It inherits the light and shadow from underneath, which is great. So I don't have to worry about working in highlights or shadows. And then that same plate mail metal on the spokes. And just finishing out those trim details with that metallic paint. I decided to use some Agrax Earthshade as kind of a quick shade for the ropes. This helps take them down in tone, but also shades in those recesses that I may have missed. I wasn't 100% accurate as well, so this helps kind of cover up some of those mistakes. Here's some Sand Golem. And I'm using this back on the main Shrine Anchorite for the base. He's standing on a very big chunk of church or something, so this is just a very quick wash of this speed paint on top. It's done a pretty good job of highlighting the stone, so I'm just making sure that I'm just going around and tidying up some of those smaller details before finishing out the base. And then I've decided to use that same Agrax Earthshade again on the windows around the steeple. This helps kind of add that nice light and shadow effect. And then finally it's time to glue on the wheel. I did cover up the ends with some blue putty so that these would glue nicely. I'm using a lot of the tones that are still left on the palette, and I'm just kind of painting in a small portrait. There's nothing too crazy about this, I'm just kind of throwing on some shapes to make it look roughly like a human being. And then on the back, I've decided to use some Wrathbone and just paint in some small crosses and shrines. I'm not too worried about these smaller details, but I still want there to be something on the back. and I felt that this was kind of thematic. Finally, I'm adding some verdigris to the wheel to help match it to the armor. I'm focusing this mainly on the metallic parts, but if it spills onto the wood, that's also great. Kind of adds to that feeling that this has been either rained on or submerged in some way. And then for the base, I'm using my usual wet ground. I've used this on all of my other Trench Crusade miniatures, and this is a great mud texture. It does dry glossy, which is great if you want like a kind of rainy mud battlefield. And then I'm just using some Iroko to quickly dry brush the stone that the shrine is standing on. This helps to edge highlight and also cover up some of those mistakes from the contrast paint. And then here's some stirred earth. This is a matte paint, but it does create the impression that mud has kind of splattered up. So I'm using this for all of the sections around the base, as well as the Shrine Anchorite's feet and some of the bottoms of the chains. I will be covering this with a matte varnish, so I'm going to lose the shine on the mud, but that's okay. I'm going to finish out the base with a black rim, and then he's a little too clean, so I decided to go back in with some blood for the blood god. I'm sponging this on just gently to create blood splatter, and once I'm happy with that, I'll then go back in with a brush and just add some smaller details with the brush itself. I'm not going too overboard. I still like the subdued, nice clean look, but I still want there to be some gore on there. And there we have it, the fearsome, imposing Shrine Anchorite. This thing is so cool. This has definitely been one of my more favorite paints for Trench Crusade so far. There's so many great models, and every time I sit down and look at them, I think, man, I can't wait to paint this. But this has been kind of top of my list for a while. I'm really happy with the way this came out, and it was definitely an exercise in weathering. But I've still got a lot more Trench Crusade to paint. So, as always, please let me know down in the comments below. What did you like about this paint job? Have you backed this as well, and are you painting some Trench Crusade right now? Also, what is the next Trench Crusade model I should be painting? As always, a huge thank you to the YouTube members that support this channel. And if you yourself are looking to support the channel in another way, the Patreon is now live, and there's a whole bunch of goodies and extras on there. As always, thank you so much for making it this far, and I will see you all in the next one.